Welcome to a great evening. Thank you for being here. I am Mr. Scalise. I'm one of the band directors here at Apple Valley High School. You're going to see 4 band directors up here tonight working with your children. It's like a really cool, awesome evening. We're going to start with the Valley Middle School 7th grade jazz ensemble under the direction of Mr. Seabird, featuring the biggest 7th grader you'll ever see on bass.
Yeah, Mr. Miller. All right, yes, this is the 7th grade jazz band. We meet about twice a week for 25 minutes during the school day. First tune's gonna be Blues by 5 by Red Garland, arranged by John Barry. Solos in this tune are gonna be Lucas Buckusheim on trumpet, Alex Erickson on vibes, Lucas Benson on trumpet, Lucas Yu on alto saxophone, Alec Anderson on trumpet, and Ali Swift on trumpet as well. There will also be some cool drum work by Lazari Shepard and Chris Sutherland. Here we go. heard Through the Grapevine, our second and final tune by Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong. They wrote it for Motown Records in 1966. Some of the most famous versions are by Marvin Gaye and Creedence Clearwater Revival, and this arrangement is by Peter Blair. You'll hear solos from Lucas Benson on trumpet, Matthew Almadine on bass clarinet, Asher Hobson on trombone, Benny Gustafson on alto sax, and Lazaria Shepard and Alex Erickson on drum set. Thank you. This.
8th grade band is coming on stage. If you're having trouble finding the program online, you can always just go to www.avhs.band and you will find a link to the program on the front landing page. Again, that's www.avhs.band.
Seventh graders, and this is 8th grade jazz, same kind of rehearsal situation. I'm David Miller, and our first solos tonight for 25 to 64 is Sophia, Geronimus, Bert Benson, Tamina Reynoso Lopez, and Levi Keon.
Use the other one.
down territories next. We have Sophia Geronimus again on alto sax this time, Levi Keon on trombone, Nolan Colty on trumpet, Burke Benson on trombone, Tamina Reyes Lopez again on tenor sax, Steve Pearson on trombone, and Lucas Benson, the separator, on trumpet. The reason why Lucas is playing is he's one of the 8 members from this group right now that were at, actually that were selected to be in All-State Jazz this year. We have 8 members, and they are Elliot Trudeau, go ahead and stand up, Sophia Geronimus, Tamina Reyes Lopez, who learned her jazz audition. She's a clarinet player, she's a great clarinet player. She learned her jazz audition in less than a month, almost on tenor, so it's amazing. Never played tenor before. And then Burke Benson on trombone, Carter Zimmerman on trombone. He played trombone in Allstate. And then we had Cameron Sheehan on trumpet and Lucas Benson. That last selection obviously also featured our, kind of each section had a little moment in there, but the saxophone section had a big long chunk in there, so great job, saxophone section. All right, so the next one's the chicken, and we have our own Jocko in the background here. Stella's gonna have quite a few moments here featured on bass by herself. And then along with her, we have Steve Pearson on trombone, Sophia Geronimus on tenor sax again, Katie Butoy on vibes, Bert Benson on trombone, Tamina Reynoso Lopez on tenor sax, Nolan Cothey on trumpet, Levi Keon on euphonium, no, trombone for this one. All right, trombone, and then Sophia, he switches back and forth, and then Sophia Geronimus and Tamina have one more little rock in. So thank you again for being such an awesome audience, and I can't wait to hear the high school here as we go forward, but thank you again.
but oh my gosh, to get to see each grade level, right? As we're going through the evening, it's just it's inspiring. It gets me, like this time of year, it's like, it's hard. Your kids are involved in a lot of stuff. You got schedule conflicts, and I'm like, what? You're not gonna be at practice? Right? It's all, and like, it can get on you, right? And bring some stress. But to see, oh my gosh, I'm really excited about where we're going and where we're headed. And then we'll top it off with some really great performances from our guest artist that's gonna come up later, and then also Jazz 2 and Jazz 1. Our next piece is called Sausalito's Strut. And it's got a strut. We've got to feature a few soloists throughout this. Here we go. feel we're blessed with a lot of drum set players. All right, a lot of drum set players. And here we have 4. And they're each taking a turn on each tune. And on top of that, they're doing a bunch of other mallet stuff, auxiliary stuff. I'm just really proud of them. So shout out to the percussionists. working with Mr. Baca twice. He came and did a clinic with every band at our high school. I'll give you a little backstory. Mr. Baca is the director of the jazz program at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. He's also a first call trumpet player. If you've ever gone to see a touring Broadway musical, you've heard him play trumpet in the pit. He's that guy. But back in 2020, I had him lined up to play this concert. And it was the first kind of jazz ensemble concert after the passing of John Zimmerman, who was a longtime band director here, who sort of started the tradition of bringing in guest artists in the first place. His family decided in lieu of like flowers and all that kind of stuff to set up a memorial fund. And so he was going to be the first using that money. So I'm glad we were able to nail him down this year to do this. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Baca. For this one, he's just going to chill a little bit and play a solo at the end. It's going to be cool.
also by Les and I also asked if it would be lame if I held these note cards, and they said yes, but I'm going to do it anyways. The next show we're going to play is Actor Age by Gordon Goodwin, and it was made famous in 2008 by the Big Fat Band, Big Fat, P-H-A-T, Fat Band. And it was transcribed to be accessible for us. So here is Actor Age. chart's going to be a little bit different. It's a Latin one. And it was written in 1938, but this transcription you're going to hear today was written from the 1962 arrangement. It was originally recorded by Duke Ellington. So we've got some clarinets on this one. Alethea is going roach, going away from the piano. This next one is near and dear to my heart. My dad was born in 1940 and he had a big band, so The only music I knew growing up was like crooners and like swing big band. I was a really cool kid, as you can probably guess. So one of the tunes they played often was "It's Only a Paper Moon." You probably know it from like Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole. They recorded it, I think, at the end of like World War II-ish times, but it was written back in the 1930s for a Broadway play that flopped. But I'm glad that they got a hold of it. We're gonna have a lot of soloists on this one. I wanted to keep Mr. Scalise busy up there. But with that, I didn't want to forget that I don't think a lot of people know how much work it takes to set up all of this stuff. I did that tape right there. But Mr. Scalise does the rest of it. So please give a hand for Mr. Scalise. Jazz 2 got to be out of class, so they were extra excited for it. So we are bringing in our very own Louis Armstrong today to perform the portrait of Louis Armstrong. So here is again Mr. Bob Hoffman.
Gonna tighten this down. Just this out. All right. Hey friends, thank you for being so patient tonight as we get through all these groups. We're gonna move ahead with a really cool tune arranged by Michael Philip Mossman. He's taken like a traditional it's not a big. Fenyalulo. It's not gonna go on the internet, I should say it right. All right, and it plays around with triplets versus twos, right? So triple, triple, 1, 2, 1. It's like playing around with that. It's actually a really advanced sort of technique for these instrumentalists this morning. So I'm really proud of the work they've done on this one. So in college, I had most of my friends convinced I was nice, right? They thought I was a nice guy. And then I went on into the broader world, and I met some really nicer people. And one of the nicest teaches drums here at Apple Valley High School. His name is Reed Kennedy. And those of you know, yeah, great. But one, yes, exactly. He is, like, I have yet to meet someone nicer. Come at me, all right? But one day he's like, hey, Mr. Scalise, come listen to this. And I'm like, okay. And he plays me this tune that we're about to play here, Strasbourg Symphony. And then like a month later, in the band room, I hear some of our students jamming out to the same tune. And I was like, it's meant to be. We're gonna do it. The nicest guy, and my students already know it, let's do it. So I found a version on the internet that I liked on YouTube, and that was done by, Germany has like state-funded public radio, and they have, some of these places have, I'm butchering this, I'm sure, big bands that are state-funded. So they're like pro players, that this is their main gig, is playing for these state bands. And so they bring out guest artists, and so they brought out Roy Hartwell, who was tunes by, and did a concert with him. And so I tracked down the arranger, wrote him in German, used my Google Translate, and my sister-in-law speaks German. And I asked, hey, can I have this chart? He said, yeah. And that's my German. That's all my German I got. And so here it is. All right, for our last 3 tunes, we're going to bring Mr. Baca back out here. The first one is a Doc Severinsen tune called Fantasy on a Love Story. One of the really cool things about bringing in someone like Mr. Baca is the stories that he tells. All right, especially if you look at his bio on the thing, you will see all these wonderful people that he's played with. But one of the coolest things, and the time I've spent with him, is him talking about his classical training background, and now he's doing all this jazz stuff, and how the two have influenced each other, and they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, they inform each other, and they're fantastic. And you'll hear that in this piece. It's a lot of classical elements. So welcome, Mr. Bond. I just love this. He just comes out, all of a sudden he's here. Come on, man.
I just can't believe what I'm hearing tonight. Raise your hand if you're related at all to any of these people tonight on stage. Raise your hand. I can't see it anyway, you're in the dark, but I'm sure that it's mostly parents. What I heard, is the 7th grade band still here yet? Give it a wow. When I first heard that band, incredibly solid. You have such a wonderful thing going on here, and you're very much to be congratulated for it. From an outsider, top notch. Top notch. Just a couple more for you. We're going to go back as far as it goes with jazz. Is a combination of Western European classical music and Eastern music. And I'd love to go into an hour lecture, but you'll have to take my class at the university to find that. But it is a combination of those two, and basically it comes down to classical structures, but the way that the instrument plays is different in jazz. And particularly, it's in something called bent tones. You do that in a classical ensemble, everyone's going to reach for their pistol. Because that is just considered gross. But for jazz, it's right. So we're going to go back to one of the most fundamental pieces that was a classical piece and has been made into a wonderful jazz piece. And Miles Zimmerman and I are going to solo it out on this one. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Amazing Grace.
for hauling the kids all the way over here. We really appreciate getting to be with you. All right. I know you didn't get enough tonight. Tomorrow night, percussion ensembles are playing on the same stage. Yes, there will be lots of setup changes. It will be awesome. All right. Really grateful to the band boosters for helping make Mr. Bacchus' appearance here tonight possible. So think every time they ask you for money or ask you to sign up for something, remember tonight. Cool. All right, we have one more. Dizzy Gillespie too, called Manteca. I don't know if you have anything you want to say.
History teacher. So we went through Louis Armstrong, and then we went through when jazz was the most popular time of the century, and that was the big band swing era. In the big band swing era in 1940, 42, there were over 1,700 big bands that were in every small town in the United States. And the smallest towns, Cameron, Wisconsin, they don't have a theater. But anybody that had a theater had a famous big band that came there. And then there was a person named Dizzy Gillespie. And Dizzy Gillespie was trying to do a new kind of music, and he called it bebop. And it failed miserably in 1942. Because it was something where you had to just sit and listen to it, and it was something where you couldn't really figure it out, you couldn't really dance to it. So in 1945, not 55, but right now, smack in the middle of the big band swing era, he formed a big band. And he went to every small town in the United States and started to play this brand new kind of music. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker, yeah. He and Charlie Parker were two of the pioneers for this music. And this song is a typical Dizzy Gillespie song. It's a bunch of licks that are thrown together. So you'll hear them, hopefully you'll be singing them on the way home, and you'll hear these little ostinatos or these little layers that are happening. And then there'd be these large open improv, and that's as far as I'm going to tell you. But I will tell you that Manteca is the white fat on a pig. Or, in that day, it was called lard. they can play it back. So in this program, there's not just one, there's all. So I'm going to play something, and the whole band is going to play it back to me. Anybody Catholic in here? We can do it. I know we can do it. And I know if we have relatives out there, the good ears that they have, they got them from their mother and father. So now you're on deck, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to sing something, and then you're going to sing it back to me. Let's see how good you do. Remember, I'm a teacher, so I do grade. We're not going to do that. Bye and do da dee da now. What kind of water do you have in this town? All right, let's do one more time. Do da do, bubble up. Do da do, bubble up. We'll do da da now.
do it.